Shana Tova. I'll begin by sharing a story with my mom's permission. Some of you know, some of you do not, that she was in the emergency room from Saturday morning until just a few hours before services last night. She is fine and here, and we are grateful that she is. She received excellent care at Duke, and I know that there are some people in our congregation who are a little bit involved with the Duke medical system, so I want to emphasize that. As I share with you a difficult moment from those 36 hours, which is that at one point she demanded to be transferred to a different hospital. And it's hard and confusing to be sick. And I tried in that moment to understand more of what was going on. Did she have concerns about the staff? No, I can't complain about the staff. Did she have concerns about the room? Was it uncomfortable? No, I can't complain about the room. Is it the food or something else? No, I can't complain about the food. I said, Mom, why do you want to be transferred to a different hospital? She said, I can't complain. My mom loves jokes, so I promised her that we would do that one. We are grateful that she is here, and to be very clear, she never demanded to be transferred to a different hospital. And yes, I'll keep my day job. My sophomore year of college was a hard one. A few weeks into the start of the swim season, I didn't like the team, I didn't like the practices, the joy of the sport was gone for me. And even though it was the main reason that I chose to go to Berkeley for college, I climbed out of the pool a few weeks into the season and quit. The coach didn't seem to care that I didn't try to talk me out of it, a fact that just confirmed my decision. I would eventually transfer to Northwestern and start swimming again my junior year, but I didn't know that then. And so for a few months on campus, I felt lost. I was 3,000 miles away from my parents, from my childhood home, from my friends, and I wasn't doing the sport that had given me my identity since I was 6 years old. I decided to take advantage of what the university had to offer, even if it was a different sort of college experience than the one that I hoped for. So I enrolled in a writing class in the Department of English with Professor Charles Muscatine, a kind older man who shared bottles of his homemade wine with his underage college students, something I don't think would fly at today's college campuses. As part of the class, he required us to interview and then write something about our fellow students. Tanya Nochesaki and I wrote about each other. And when we shared our results the following class, what she wrote about me was such an extraordinary gift that I kept it all of these years. And a few months ago, I fished it out of some files, one of those boxes that we all keep at home, filled with memories. And here's a little snippet of what she wrote. As we were walking back to his scooter, I drove a scooter that year, after the interview, a friend of mine yelled hello to me in passing. The next day, this friend asked me who was the jock frat boy with whom she saw me. I just shook my head. Here was the dark spot. Daniel had told me the night before that he hated to be misjudged, that people often assumed that because he was an athlete, he was unintelligent and superficial. Daniel is neither of those things, and anyone who took a ride on his scooter would be able to see that. With those words, Tanya gifted me the blessing of feeling seen and understood beyond a simple stereotype. It's such a basic human need that we all have to feel known, not as a figment of someone else's imagination, but in our uniqueness and individuality. And it's something that we need more desperately as this year comes to a close and a new year begins. I heard a wonderful concert this summer at the Hartman Institute with Hanan Ben Ari, an Israeli singer who crosses over between the religious world in which he grew up and whose music is popular with general Israeli society. In his song Wikipedia, which I sent out to you before the high holidays, and I hope you had a chance to listen to it and that you liked it, but if not, go check your emails. He sarcastically sings, quote, "We don't let reality stop us from seeing." And then he goes on to list a lot of stereotypes in Israel, that every leftist is a traitor, every Arab is a suicide bomber, every Haredi is a thief, and all the settlers killed Rabin. And he goes on, and then he pleads in the song, "Don't lock me in a cage. Don't summarize me on Wikipedia." It's been a year in which more and more others have tried to summarize Jews on Wikipedia, in which it's become harder and harder for us to feel known and understood by others and even to ourselves. One reason for that may be what the singer Ben Ari is singing about, that we are living in an instant culture that jumps to conclusions where people have hundreds of friends online but fewer and fewer people who we spend time with and know intimately, in which we furiously post and tag but seldom look into another's eyes and listen to their stories. In her TED Talk, The Dangers of a Single Story, Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie tells about how her college roommates assumed that since she was from Nigeria, she listened to tribal music and didn't know how to use a stove. How her roommate, and I quote, "felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals." In our society, we are far too good now at stereotyping each other, at labeling each other, at putting each other in boxes without getting to know people in their complexity. We are skilled single storytellers. And those single stories are having a catastrophic effect on our politics, on our culture, on our communities. And this place must be a haven from that culture, a beacon of countercultural resistance. And if we can't be a community where each of us can feel truly known and understood in the fullness of our uniqueness, we should pack it up and go home, because we miss entirely the meaning and possibility of being a religious and Jewish community. According to some of our sources, today is not actually the birthday of the world. That was actually celebrated, according to these sources, 6 days ago. And according to these sources, Rosh Hashanah celebrates not the birthday of the world, but the birthday of the first human being. The Mishnah in Sanhedrin teaches that human beings stamp many coins with one seal, and all the coins are like one another, but the Holy One of Blessing stamped every human being with the seal of Adam Harishon, the first human being, and yet not one of them is like another. To see another human being in their uniqueness is to bear witness to God's greatness. To view someone as a stereotype or a category is to diminish not only the person themselves, but the image of God in whom they were created. We are swimming against a tide. We are part of an American culture and perhaps more malevolent forces from the outside that push us to judge and to hate each other And we must fight against that tide. And it's also true that being a Jew is complicated. We don't fit neatly into boxes. And it is that complexity that I want to spend some time unpacking this high holidays. The New York Times columnist Mati Friedman put out a book this year called Spies of No Country, about a group of Jews from Arab countries who served as Israel's earliest spies because they didn't have to learn how to fit into Arab society because their families had been in places such as Aleppo and Baghdad for thousands of years. He writes about how double identity has always been part of life for Jews. Esther, that wasn't her Hebrew name. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah. And she hid her Jewish identity until the right moment and used her beauty to foil a genocide. Joseph had an Egyptian name, Tzofat Paneah, and became so thoroughly Egyptian that his own brothers didn't recognize him years later when they came to Egypt for food. Moses was raised in the Egyptian palace and goes out to his people and leads them to freedom and leaves Pharaoh's kingdom destroyed. I want to note something, though, about Jews and double identity. It's been part of Jewish life for generations, but it has also been a source of anti-Semitic tropes about dual loyalty. And those tropes have no place in public discourse, and they have to be fought on the left and on the right. But with that said, Judaism from the very beginning, to be Jewish was to be of two worlds. And that was a defining feature of Jewish identity. Our story begins when Abraham is told by God, go forth from your land, lech lecha me'artzecha, from your birthplace, from your father's house to the land that I will show you. And God tells him this because the task that God has in mind for Abraham and Sarah requires apparently that they be different from their surroundings. They can't blend in, God is saying. You have to go and you have to be a stranger and leave behind all that you know. And in some ways in that new society, you are going to be alone if you are going to achieve the greatness that I have in store for you. But the story continues. Not only are you going to be alone, God says in the very next verse, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great and make you a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. God is saying you can't be of the world that you came from, but when you get to the new world, your task isn't just to be alone, it is also to be of service to the world. You're going to create a new people, a people that the prophet Bilam later on will bless in the Bible as Am Levadad Yishkon, a people who dwells apart, but a people in service of other peoples, a blessing. It is still the case that to be a Jew is to live in two worlds. Perhaps no image demonstrates this for the American Jewish community as this one. It is the front page of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette days after the terrible massacre last November at the Tree of Life Synagogue. We should not take for granted what an extraordinary image this is. An American newspaper puts Hebrew letters of a Jewish prayer that its non-Jewish readers do not understand onto its front page. The message in doing that is, you are of us. We mourn with you. It is an image that says how deeply American Jews have arrived, that we have succeeded, that we are integrated and are accepted and beloved by our fellow Americans as Jews. And this image comes in the wake of a moment of excruciating Jewish vulnerability. In the wake of someone walking into a synagogue and murdering Jews because they're Jews. We live in two worlds. We are accepted and powerful, and we are fragile, and we are vulnerable. We are celebrating our high holidays in a new and beautiful new building that cost $6 million to renovate. We number 400 member families, and downstairs, I was down there for the family service, and our multi-purpose room was filled with young families and children. We are strong and we are growing as a congregation, and this campus is equipped with 18 security cameras and panic buttons. I have a panic button. And it's not imagined, and it's not hysterical, it's real. And people who are truly our friends must acknowledge not only our strength, but our vulnerability too. We feel misunderstood, not only by others who stereotype us, but also it's confusing for us as American Jews. One question that many of our children and we are asking ourselves are we white? In her landmark 1998 book, How Jews Became White Folks and What That Tells Us About Race in America, Professor Karen Brodkin describes how Jews and other white ethnics' upward mobility was the result of the GI Bill and FHA and VA mortgages that allowed us to float on a rising economic tide, but, and she writes, to African Americans, the government offered the cement boots of segregation, redlining, urban renewal, and discrimination. Those racially skewed gains have been passed across the generations. It is true not all Jews are wealthy and well-educated. Our local JFS and JFS agencies all over the country care for Jews in need who suffer from poverty and hunger. But as a community, American Jews are and are understood by many as white, not genetically, but the way in which race is culturally and socially constructed. And most of us who look white are beneficiaries of white privilege. And we need to reflect on that fact and understand how it impacts our lives and those around us. I want to clarify something further about this. Jews are not racially white. We are not racially anything uniform, even though when you look around this room, you might assume otherwise. That people, both Jews and non-Jews, think so is another single story with catastrophic consequences. There are many Jews of color in our congregation and in the American Jewish community. There are African American Jews, and there are Sephardic Jews, and there are Syrian Jews, and there are North African Jews, and there are biracial Jews, and their story is too seldom told and too often trampled upon in ways big and small, such as when someone says casually or jokingly, "You don't look Jewish." It is true that according to halakha, Judaism is passed on biologically, that a child born to a Jewish mother is Jewish, but it is not passed on exclusively so. Anyone can choose to be Jewish, and every moment that any human being makes that choice is an eternal blessing. My work with Jews of choice is some of the most rewarding work of my rabbinate, and Jews by choice are among the most committed and active members of this community and many others. And if we think that Jews, quote, look a certain way, we betray our own ignorance. And we diminish Torah and the divine image of God. Other Jews have been pushed away because they were gay or different in some way, less subtly. Maybe they didn't have the privilege of a strong Jewish upbringing. And I'm proud of the strides that we have made in this community to make it more welcoming and more accessible to everyone who is looking to connect to Jewish life. When Judaism is passed on biologically only, when we don't choose Judaism by actively participating in Jewish communal life through study and observance, then Jewish identity weakens. People may continue to be Jews, but the covenant between God and the Jewish people becomes a shell of its former self. Perhaps worst of all, when biology is emphasized over deed, when we say that Jews, quote, look a certain way, a soft or hard racism is given license in our communal culture that is nothing less than a desecration of God's name. That Jews in America are largely understood as culturally white has also meant that many liberal Jews have now been told that they don't belong as full allies in intersectional spaces. Jews at the Women's March and the Dyke March have been told that they have no right to march with the Star of David, a symbol that is not only on the flag of Israel, but historically a Jewish symbol. Jewish students on campus who are Zionists or who are perceived as Zionists have been told that they have no place because they are part of a white hegemonic power structure and are powerful but not vulnerable. And Israel, as the only Jewish nation state in the world, also lives in two worlds, because Israel is both strong and vulnerable. Israel is seen by some as a white country because Britain was a European colonizer and was the last controlling power in pre-state Palestine before the United Nations vote created Israel in 1947. Some see Israel this way because she is stronger militarily than perhaps at any time in her short history, and because Israel exercises military control over the lives of Palestinians in the West Bank and maintains a naval blockade against Hamas in Gaza. Israel is seen by many as white because political and cultural and racial discrimination does exist in Israel, and saying so doesn't make you anti-Israel. It exists against Israeli Arabs, against Ethiopians, against, quote, Edot HaMizrach, a term that refers to Jewish communities from the Arab and Islamic world, but that white European Zionists condescendingly lump together with a decidedly Western bias, a term that means Jews of the East. But telling only one story about Israel, labeling Israel as white, as a colonizing European project, is a characterization that erases the indigenous history of half of the Jewish population of Israel, who have roots in the Islamic and Arab world. It erases the history of Ethiopian Jews who yearned and prayed to return to Israel, and whose ingathering to the Jewish people after thousands of years of separation from rabbinic Judaism is one of Israel's most inspiring and extraordinary stories. Labeling Israel as white erases Arab Christians, Arab Muslims, Druze, and other minorities who constitute 20% of Israel's population, many who see themselves as Israeli and have risen to become the head of Israel's Supreme Court, the head of Israel's largest bank, and who constitute a significant portion of Israel's medical community as doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and researchers. Labeling Israel as white erases the indigenous history of Jews not only in the Middle East, in places like Aleppo, where Eric Kittel is from, where the Jewish community existed for hundreds of years before the 7th century Muslim Arab conquest of that city. It erases the continuous history of Jews living in the land of Israel from the time of the Bible until today. Yossi Klein Halevi has written about how Zionism is not a single story. It's two stories, what he calls the meeting point between need and longing. The Zionism of need, he writes, is a story we all told very well of pogroms, of the Dreyfus trial, of the Holocaust, but we forget about what he calls the Zionism of longing, the half-forgotten story of how we managed to preserve the centrality of the land of Israel and Jewish consciousness in every corner of the globe where Jews lived for thousands of years. And he says, by continuing to tell a Eurocentric Zionist story, Israel is misunderstood as a European colonialist project. We need to learn and remember and retell the story of our indigenousness, of our Easternness, about the 2,000-year-old story of yearning to return to a place that we call home. And labeling Israel a white country erases Jewish vulnerability in that part of the world. It ignores 150,000 rockets on Israel's northern border, controlled by Iran's proxy, Hezbollah, in violation of all United Nations resolutions. It ignores Iran's stated desires to annihilate Israel with nuclear weapons, Hamas's stated aim to murder Jews not only in Israel but around the world, to destroy Israel, and its cynical continuing use of funds that could build hospitals and schools, but instead build elaborate underground tunnels whose sole purpose is the killing of innocents. And it erases Hamas's responsibility for acquiring rockets and missiles that have terrorized a generation of Israeli children who have gone to bed and who wet their beds as teenagers, and adults who suffer from PTSD because they live for year upon year upon year, always needing to know where is the nearest bomb shelter. In his book, The Cheese and the Worms, the anthropologist Carlo Ginzburg tells a story about a medieval peasant who milled grain for the king. And the miller works in the palace. And because he does, he has access to the king, to the royalty. But of course, he doesn't belong there. And so he's never accepted as royalty, and his presence there is predicated upon what he can do for the royalty. He works in the palace but does not belong. And when he returns home from work, what happens is his fellow peasants look at him and say, "Oh, look who works in the castle. Look who thinks he's special." And so he doesn't belong in the market either. He has access to both worlds, and he is at home in neither. He's alone. Am levadad yishkon. This is the Jewish experience. We enjoy the benefits of white privilege, benefits given to those of us whose skin is white. I promise you, we are not afraid of the police. the way that African Americans are. We live in Durham, a city that was formed by the redlining practices that Brodkin described in her book. We live in a part of the country that was built upon the backs of black slaves who were brought here against their will and treated with savage brutality. All of that is true, and anti-Semitism is real. It persists. And we're being killed for being Jews in 21st century America. Living in two worlds is lonely. And having access to many places but being nowhere at home is a difficult burden to bear. But it is also a blessing. There were cards that were handed out to you, little sermon cards, trying to continue that tradition from Rabbi Sager. Look at your cards. It says, go forth. What God says to Abraham, leave what's familiar. I need you to be a stranger. Those dots are not an easy path, but they have purpose. Go forth and be a blessing. God's words are not a promise. They're a challenge to responsibility. How do we be a blessing? First, we have to use our privilege and power and access to it to advocate on behalf of those who don't have it. 36 times the Torah admonishes us, don't afflict the stranger, the refugee, the powerless in society. Ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim, because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. Our deepest memory is having suffered. And if we have access to privilege and to power, we must use it to speak on behalf of those who don't. But we can't be a blessing by sacrificing our identity, by blending in and forgetting our Jewishness or ignoring our own vulnerability, both here in the United States and that of the State of Israel. The threats of anti-Semitism and terrorism and violence and a turbulent Middle East that surround the Jewish state are real, and we must demand from our friends and public officials that they see and acknowledge all of us, that they hear many stories, not just one. We must tell them, don't lock me in a cage, don't summarize me on Wikipedia. And how do we be a blessing here at home in Bethel? It's really quite easy. Get to know someone. Better yet, get to know someone who you think you'll disagree with. Share your story, and when they share theirs, don't be judgmental, be curious. Ask questions. When you see that we are convening conversations about challenging topics, please come. Or take a class and get to know people, or just sit at Kiddush after services. Invite someone to your home for Shabbat dinner. Our community should be a place where we are curious, not judgmental, and through our curiosity, we can feel the gift and give the gift of being truly known to others. And Bethel must be a blessing to others, and you can help us. This year, you can be part of our interfaith programming. There are very exciting things that are going on. You can host someone, one of our friends. Don't let it end. One of our friends from the Trinity Avenue Presbyterian Church or the River Church. In your home, invite them for a Shabbat dinner or just to come over. Join our text learning with a local mosque. Speak with Leslie Winter and Jerry Postema about joining me and Reverend Katie Crow on an interfaith trip to Israel next July and August. Or closer to home, Rachel Bierman, I think she's right there. Raise your hand, Rachel. Right? is working with a representative of the River Church for our communities to travel together to Washington, D.C., and to spend one afternoon visiting the U.S. Holocaust Memorial and the next morning visiting the African American History Museum in what will be an extraordinary trip and an extraordinary experience so that we can share our stories and we can learn the stories of our neighbors. I thought a lot about this topic and this talk today. And there are many reasons why I chose to share all of this with you, but the truth is, I think I needed to talk about this because I too want to be known and seen and understood. And I feel alone sometimes. As a rabbi, I live in at least two worlds. I live in the American Jewish community where I was born and to which I've committed my professional life, my religious life, my personal life. I live with you and love and care about this community very, very much. And Libi Ma'Mizrach, my heart is in the East. It's in Israel. It's with the state of Israel, where I first experienced the richness of Jewish life. It's a place that I return to for soul sustenance. It doesn't exist in theory. It's where I have friends and family who I love very, very much. And as a rabbi, I live between two other worlds. I love Judaism. I love Torah, I love Tefillah, I love God and our tradition. I love the sanctuary of our tradition, which stands outside of time and speaks the language of eternity. But I also live in a world which is on fire, a world with a raging political culture, in and through which we fight for what is right against hunger and racism and injustice. And as I stand before you this Rosh Hashanah, I feel stretched. I feel spread thin like butter on a piece of bread. Worried like I've never been worried before, that the center isn't going to hold, that stereotypes that we hurl at each other are destroying the American Jewish community, the American community, that the American Jewish community and Israel are walking away from each other. I worry that our own congregation is losing the capacity to speak to each other and to love each other. That we're losing our ability to hold and to hear many, many stories and to be with each other in the fullness of each person. And I don't want that to happen. And keeping that from happening is what I will give my dying breath for. In his closing remarks to a group of several hundred rabbis this summer at the Hartman Institute, the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, Yehuda Kurtzer, encouraged us to create a mass movement of nuance and subtlety. It's a movement we desperately need. And it's a great vision for our community. Can we see and talk with each other with nuance and subtlety? Can we bear witness to one another and ask others to bear witness to our fullest selves? Can we not hear a single story, but many stories? Then and only then, the day of redemption will come, when each person will receive the blessing that Tanya gave to me so long ago, of feeling known and understood not as a stereotype, but in the fullness of my deepest self. And on that day, when we do that for each other, the words of the liturgy will be fulfilled. V'yeyasu chulam aguda achad la'asot ritzoncha belevav shalem. Then we shall be bound together, doing God's will with a full heart. Ken yehi ratzon, let it be so. And let us say, Amen.